Hello, and welcome to the first in our series of Conversations on Land Reform. For this series, we're keen to hear from some of the key stakeholders involved in land reform and what their thoughts and experiences have been so far, and what they expect to see as it all progresses. What we're aiming to do is create a platform for all sides of the debate to have their say. My name is Alex Buchan, and I'm a partner in the rural business team at Brodie's, specialising in all property aspects of the rural sector, but with a particular focus on landed estates. Whilst the term land reform generally brings to mind matters such as community right to buy or the right of responsible access, one area of legal reform that's just of particular interest and indeed some concern to many landed estates relates to residential tenancies. The Scottish Government has been considering further reform in this area, and in December 2021 published its draft strategy document entitled A New Deal for Tenants, which, among other matters, seeks to place private rented sector tenants on a more equal footing with social rented tenants through the introduction of a new housing bill. One of the proposals relates to removal of the mandatory grounds allowing landlords to regain possession of a private rented property. The private rented tenancy, or PRT, which was introduced in December 2017, provided more security of tenure for private sector tenants than had been the case under short assured tenancies, requiring one of 18 grounds to be established before repossession could take place. There's a number of grounds, in effect, specified events, such as a sale of the property, which are mandatory, i.e., if the landlord establishes that ground, then the tenant requires to remove from the property. The Coronavirus Recovery and Reform Scotland Bill, which has just passed stage 2 in the Scottish Parliament, seeks to remove these mandatory grounds for repossession in respect of both still existing short assured tenancies and current and future PRTs. In brief, this legislation will result in private sector landlords having no statutory right to regain possession of their let properties. Rather, it will be at the discretion of the first tier tribunal dealing with housing matters. So, having set the scene, I'm delighted to be joined today by Stuart Young. Stuart is the Chief Executive of Dunecht Estates, a diverse rural property-based business extending to some 53,000 acres in Aberdeenshire and Kincardineshire, and comprising 6 separate estates, stretching from Stonehaven in the east across to Strathdon in the west. The estate's business interests include farming, both in-hand and tenanted, forestry, field sports, minerals, commercial lets and tourism, including the iconic Dunotter Castle. Additionally, a very important part of the estate's business is residential property, and specifically the private rented sector. So, Stuart, thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me today. Could I start by asking how many private residential lettings there are on Dunecht Estates and the importance of these to the overall business?
Hello, Alex. We have around 200 let houses across the estates with a mix of PRTs, short assured tenancies and regulated tenancies. Income from the residential portfolio is very significant and represents by some distance Dunecht's most significant revenue stream.
Right, that's a very large portfolio of properties, which, as you say, are the estate's largest income generator. Clearly, these let properties are important for the revenue of the estates, but ownership at that scale must present challenges.
Yes, there are undoubted challenges, not least in terms of compliance. And we can see from the Scottish Government's recent consultation on a new deal for tenants that the level of compliance is likely to increase, especially in relation to very ambitious energy efficiency standards. Current compliance requirements consume much administrative and professional time, and that demand will only going to become more of a burden.
Yes, when you mention the significant revenue stream, it must be remembered that this comes at a cost, not only in terms of ongoing repair and maintenance, which in the context of 200 let properties is a daunting prospect in itself, but also administrative, management and professional costs, the current compliance requirements and upcoming energy efficiency targets. Notwithstanding those challenges, to date the estates have remained committed to the private rented sector. What benefits do you think a private landlord, such as Dunecht Estates, brings to the communities in which they let and manage properties?
I think that private landlords provide choice and accessibility to housing that might not otherwise exist. Not everyone, particularly the younger generation, is able to afford to buy a house, and there's little availability in the social rented sector. This is especially so in rural areas where there's been great market demand for country living following the pandemic. Private rented housing provides both a stepping stone for those who then progress and buy their own property, and also long-term homes for those who remain in the sector. Without these opportunities, local people have fewer options, and finding staff and contractors to work on the estates becomes far harder.
Yes, I suppose that a reduction in private rented housing could well lead to rural depopulation on the simple basis that if people have nowhere to live, then they have to move on. Although, picking up on your comment about market demand for country living, we might be looking more at repopulation rather than depopulation. The properties will still exist, but if put to the market, will go to the highest bidder, perhaps as second homes or main residences benefiting from work from home policies and within an easy commute of Aberdeen. That wouldn't lead to depopulation per se, but would start to change the makeup of the affected rural communities. Do you think the proposed changes, whereby landlords would not be guaranteed to get the property back, might affect the estate's policy on residential letting?
Yes, I think that's inevitable. It's not that Dunecht has regularly relied on the mandatory grounds, but they've provided certainty of possession in limited but important circumstances. I fully understand the need to protect tenants from unscrupulous actions, but I'm not aware of evidence that identified abuse of the mandatory grounds. The changes to the repossession grounds also need to be looked at in the context of the compliance burden we've already talked about, and the prospect of new legislation that further enhances the tenant's rights. Simply put, with the pendulum swinging too far towards the tenant, Dunecht will be reviewing its letting policy.
So there's a tipping point where the return on investment and the advantages of being a private landlord become outweighed by the downsides. You make a good point. This needs to all be looked at in the round, and any further restriction on the ability to regain possession may represent that tipping point for some landlords. In your own experience and from your knowledge of the sector more widely, do you feel that there's a need for these proposed reforms?
As I've already said, I don't believe the changes proposed are supported by any weight of evidence. What seems odd in the extreme is that the changes to the possession grounds are being introduced when the Scottish Government is still consulting on its future housing strategy. It would have seemed much more sensible to have completed that process with a view to arriving at a comprehensive approach, rather than dealing with matters in an ad hoc way.
Yes, that comprehensive approach ties back in with what I was saying about looking at this in the round rather than bringing in these reforms in isolation. So this uncertainty on regaining possession means that landlords could end up with a sitting tenant even if they want to sell the property in question. That's surely going to affect the value.
It's the loss of certainty that's most worrying, and there's strong opinion that without an absolute ability to recover possession if the landlord wants to sell, capital values will fall by 30 to 50%. That's not appealing to the landlord, and while not applicable to Dunecht, I doubt that loss in value is going to appeal to mortgage lenders either.
So worst case scenario could see capital values reduced by 50%. On a portfolio of 200 houses, that actual figure must run into tens of millions of pounds. And as you note, where there's lending in place, even the more conservative figure of a 30% reduction in value would certainly see many borrowers, investors breach their loan covenants. Whilst I can see how value could be impacted, I suppose that if an investor was looking to buy, then a good sitting tenant might actually be desirable.
Yes, I think that's a fair statement, but I'm not aware of an active investment market existing in rural areas. My understanding is that investment interest lies where there are large volumes in urban centres. Also, we know from a new deal for tenants that the Scottish Government has rent controls on its radar, and I believe that prospect will turn away investors, however good the sitting tenant may be.
Yes, the prospect of rent controls is another important factor and goes to the heart of the tipping point we mentioned on return on investment, with landlords facing increased costs against static rents, which may be actually reducing in real terms due to inflation. We've been speaking about these proposals in the context of Dunecht Estates, which is in part a property letting business. However, it occurs to me that these changes could also have consequences for others, such as someone, say, with just one buy-to-let property.
I think that there will be a reaction from small landlords too. The imminent changes to the possession grounds and the prospect of further legislative change, added to the existing compliance obligations, will inevitably have a negative impact. Some will be managing their property themselves and decide that the burden has become too great, whereas those employing an agent will see costs increasing and margins that may simply be no longer attractive.
Yeah, so again, it looks like smaller investors may identify a point where it's no longer worthwhile, or they may fall foul of their borrowing commitments if there's a decrease in value and be forced to exit the market. Also, if there's any doubt about regaining possession, particularly in the event of a proposed sale, then that may be a risk too far, where the proceeds of that sale may represent someone's pension pot. Finally, and I touched on this earlier when mentioning the possibility of repopulation, if these proposals do become law, and if that does result in the estates reducing their exposure to the private rented sector, do you have a view, Stuart, on what rural housing will look like in the future?
Yes, well, I think it's highly likely that some houses will be sold, and in certain parts of rural Scotland, that could see further growth in second home ownership. I suspect other properties will be converted to short-term lets. I've already touched on the impact of contraction in the private rented sector. The social and economic implications are something that the Scottish Government should be examining very closely and understanding as it develops its future housing strategy.
Thank you. So just to recap, these proposals, if enacted in their current form, will mean that landlords have no certainty that they can regain possession of their private rented sector property, both in terms of future and existing tenancy agreements. There's no doubt that tenants should be protected against eviction by unscrupulous landlords, but there's already various provisions to mitigate against that. As we've heard, the inability to regain possession may result in private landlords leaving or perhaps being forced from the market, with the consequences which we've discussed. It would be unfortunate if legislation intended to benefit private sector tenants led to a situation where previously available housing was removed from the letting market and people, particularly in rural areas, found themselves with no option but to relocate. Hopefully, the potential consequences of these apparently well-intentioned provisions will be fully considered and understood before they appear on the statute book. That brings us to the end of our discussion for today. Thanks very much again to you, Stuart, for joining us and for sharing your thoughts. And thanks, of course, to our audience for listening in. Look out for future episodes over the coming months where we'll hear from some other key stakeholders as the conversation progresses. If you have any feedback, any questions on land reform, or suggestions for future topics or speakers, please do contact us using the details on screen.